In the grand, often cynical, theater of American politics, some events are manufactured for spectacle. They are less about governance, less about truth-finding, and entirely about the performance. The Senate Committee on Oversight and Economic Development hearing, convened on the afternoon of March 15, 2025, was, by every indication, designed to be one such performance. The script had been written in advance, the roles had been cast, and the star was expected to shine. The Senate hearing room itself carried that particular electric tension that precedes a preordained political coronation. This was not a quiet deliberation over agricultural subsidies. This was an event. The C-SPAN cameras, positioned at 3 distinct angles, were not merely recording, they were broadcasting a narrative. Their glowing red lights felt less like objective observers and more like the warning beacons of an impending collision. The gallery was a physical manifestation of the new political divide, packed to capacity. A sea of carefully curated activism. In the front rows sat the progressive acolytes. There, tax the rich, buttons and branded apparel gleaming under the flat, unforgiving fluorescent lights, a visible claque ready to offer applause at the designated moments. In the back, crammed shoulder to shoulder, were the journalists, the digital scribes of the modern era, fingers poised over keyboards, ready to translate the coming monologues into 280-character bursts of outrage or adoration. The topic, on its face, was aggressively mundane: the impact of state tax incentives on job creation. On any other Tuesday, this title would be a potent legislative sedative, drawing a half-empty room and coverage relegated to the back pages of industry trade journals. But today was different. Today, the committee had invited a guest who transcended the dull mechanics of policy. They had invited a symbol. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, at 35, was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a movement, a brand, an icon, and for her millions of followers, the undisputed prophet of a new progressive era. Her invitation as an expert witness was the entire point. At the dais, the senators settled into their deep leather chairs. The political choreography obvious. On the Democratic side, the architects of this moment looked pleased, almost smug. Senators Warren and Sanders, her political godparents, were in attendance, their presence a silent endorsement. They had orchestrated this invitation with meticulous care, handing their brightest star a national, taxpayer-funded platform to evangelize her economic gospel. This was, in their calculation, a softball hearing. A chance for Ocasio-Cortez to deliver a fiery, pre-packaged speech that would dominate the evening news cycle and flood social media with viral clips. On the Republican side, the mood was one of polite, almost weary resignation. Most wore the expressions of men who had already accepted the day's narrative. They knew their role, to serve as the silent, scowling backdrop for the progressive triumph. Their staffers were, at that very moment, likely drafting the counter-statements for Fox News, complaining about the socialist sermon they had just endured. They were prepared to lose the public relations battle for the next 48 hours and then move on. All except one. At the far end of the Republican side, partially obscured by the camera angles focused on the committee chairman, sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. At 74, he was a study in studied inconspicuousness. He wore his reading glasses perched on his nose, bifocals that suggested a man who spent his evenings reading history, not opposition research. Before him lay a single yellow legal pad, its surface covered in a neat, almost fussy script. A slight, inscrutable smile played at the corners of his mouth. His navy suit had seen better days, the fabric carrying the telltale sheen of a garment pressed one too many times. His tie was a relic, likely chosen by his wife a decade and a half prior. He looked, in totality, like someone's kindly grandfather. He could have been a retired insurance salesman from Baton Rouge, a small-town pharmacist, or the deacon of his local church. And that, of course, was the entire point. John Kennedy had meticulously crafted a political career built on the foundation of being profoundly underestimated. His Louisiana drawl, as thick as molasses in winter, was a disarming weapon. His folksy, self-deprecating demeanor, "I'm just a simple country lawyer," was a form of political camouflage, designed to lure his opponents into a false sense of intellectual superiority. He would ask questions that seemed naive, almost rambling, lulling witnesses into a state of comfortable condescension. Then, the trap would spring. With a surgical precision that belied the country grandfather persona. Kennedy would dismantle them. He wouldn't use rhetoric, he would use facts. He wouldn't raise his voice, he would use their own words. Their own documents, their own public statements against them, stacking them one by one like bricks in a wall until the witness had no room to maneuver. No escape route, no rhetorical exit. His colleagues on the Hill had a name for it. They called it the Louisiana smile. It was a clinical diagnosis. You didn't realize you'd been cut until you felt the warm rush of blood and saw the expressions of horror on the faces of your own staff. Kennedy wasn't a brawler, he was a political assassin who used facts as his stiletto. And as he sat there, calmly reviewing his notes, that slight, grandfatherly smile never wavered. He was, in a room full of performers, the only one who had read the entire script, including the surprise ending he was about to write. The great chamber doors swung open, and an expectant hush fell over the room. The background murmur of conversation, the rustling of papers, the whispered consultations, all of it ceased. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the hearing room not merely as a witness, but as the headline event, and she moved with the practiced, radiant confidence of someone who knows all cameras are turned her way. In essence, she was walking onto a stage, and at 35, she had proven herself a grand master of political performance. The cameras, her constant companions, loved her. Social media, her native territory, adored her. Her millions of followers didn't just support her, they hung on every tweet, every Instagram live, every strategically crafted viral moment. She was the face of a new, telegenic, and uncompromising brand of politics. She wore a burgundy suit, a bold color choice that stood out against the drab grays and navies of the Senate. The tailoring was impeccable. A silent statement of arrival that likely cost more than a month's rent for many of the constituents she so passionately championed. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture exuding a confidence that bordered on defiant. This was her arena. She took her seat at the witness table, adjusted the microphone with a practiced hand, and flashed a brilliant, assured smile at the friendly faces on the Democratic side of the dais. Senator Warren offered an encouraging nod. Senator Sanders, her political godfather, looked on with an expression of paternal pride. This was his revolution, now broadcast in high definition. Committee Chairman Roberts, a moderate Democrat from Connecticut who already looked like he might regret the day's spectacle, gavelled the hearing to order. The committee will come to order, he announced, his voice flat. We're honored today to welcome Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York's 14th Congressional District to share her insights on progressive economic development strategies. Ocasio-Cortez leaned into the microphone, the room's focus narrowing to a single point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for this opportunity. What followed was 20 minutes of vintage AOC. It was a political tour de force. An opening statement delivered with the fiery passion of a revival preacher and the absolute, unshakable confidence of someone who has perhaps never been truly, forensically challenged in a hostile forum. She spoke without notes, a clear sign of meticulous preparation, her voice rising and falling with a practiced, compelling rhythm. For too long, she began, her tone one of righteous indignation. We've watched states and cities grovel at the feet of corporate America. We've watched them offer billions in tax breaks, in subsidies, in what can only be called legalized bribery, all for the promise. The empty promise of job creation. Her voice grew stronger, projecting to the activists in the back rows. We've watched billionaires play states against each other like chess pieces, extracting every possible concession while our workers struggle to afford rent, while our schools crumble, while our infrastructure fails, and we're told this is just how the game is played. That we have no choice. That we must bow to corporate power or be left behind. She paused, a classic rhetorical device, letting the weight of her accusation hang in the air. Her eyes swept the room, making contact with the senators, the press, the gallery. Well, I am here to tell you we have a choice. And some of us have made it. The activists in the gallery murmured their approval, a call and response she had come to expect. In my district, she continued, we faced this exact scenario. Amazon, One of the richest corporations in human history, owned by the richest man in the world, demanded nearly $3 billion in tax incentives to build their headquarters in Queens. $3 billion. Money that could have gone to schools, to hospitals, to our infrastructure. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, creating an intimate, conspiratorial moment with the cameras. And when we said no, when we stood up to corporate greed, we were told we were foolish. We were told we'd killed jobs. We were told we didn't understand economics. Here, she smiled, a self-satisfied smirk. Well, let me tell you what happened. Amazon came to New York anyway. Without the tax breaks, without the corporate welfare, because they needed us more than we needed them. And we saved billions of dollars that can now go to the people who actually need it. The activists erupted in applause. A wave of vindication. Chairman Roberts made a half-hearted, almost symbolic attempt to gavel them back to quiet. This is the model we need across America, AOC declared, her voice at its crescendo. No more corporate welfare. No more billionaire handouts. No more using our tax dollars to line the pockets of the wealthy while working people suffer. And then, she made her pivot. Her tone shifted from impassioned to mocking. From preacher to prosecutor. It was a calculated, personal jab, and she directed it squarely at the Republican side of the dais. Now, I know some senators here might not understand this, she said, dripping with condescension. Some senators, particularly from certain southern states that have made a business model out of corporate welfare, might think this approach is crazy. She paused, searching for the zinger she had clearly prepared. They might think, to borrow a phrase, that you can land on the sun if you go at night. A few people in the gallery laughed, validating the insult. Down at the end of the table, John Kennedy's gentle smile didn't waver. But anyone watching with a trained eye, anyone who wasn't mesmerized by the performance, would have noticed his pen pause for just a single, precise moment on his yellow legal pad. AOC, warming to her theme, pressed the attack. These same senators represent states where oil companies write the laws, where workers have no rights, where environmental protections are a joke. They take corporate donations by the truckload and then lecture us about fiscal responsibility. Well, the American people are tired of it. They're tired of being sold out. They're tired of senators who work for ExxonMobil instead of for them. She sat back, her closing line delivered with the finality of a mic drop. It's time we stop letting corporations dictate our economic policy. It's time we put people over profits. Thank you. The progressive half of the gallery exploded. It was a standing ovation from the cheap seats. Chairman Roberts let it go on for several seconds. This was, after all, the good television the Democrats had planned for. He finally gavelled the room to order. Thank you, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. We'll now begin questions from committee members. We'll use the standard 5-minute rule. Senator Kennedy. The room collectively held its breath. The star had delivered her monologue. The supporting cast had applauded. And now, the folksy, unassuming senator from Louisiana was being given the first word. Kennedy had been methodically underlining sections of his notes throughout AOC's entire 20-minute broadside. Now, he slowly, almost theatrically, removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. He took a deliberate sip of water. He cleared his throat. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez, not with anger or outrage, but with the same gentle, slightly bemused expression a grandfather might use when about to explain to a child why. In fact, jumping off the garage roof with a bedsheet parachute wouldn't end well. Well now, Congresswoman, he began, his Louisiana drawl thick and slow as honey, coating the room. That was quite a performance. Reminded me of a mockingbird we had back home. Lots of noise, early in the morning, very passionate. But I always wondered if there was any substance behind all that chirping. A few nervous laughs rippled from the Republican side. AOC's brilliant smile tightened, just slightly, at the edges. You've had your say, and you said it beautifully. Kennedy continued, his tone amiable, almost complimentary, very inspiring, almost made me want to go join a protest. But if the chairman permits, I'd like to ask the Congresswoman a few questions about this remarkable record of economic leadership she's so proud of. Chairman Roberts nodded, his expression already one of profound regret. The senator is recognized. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. affecting the very picture of casual, professorial interest. The preacher had finished her sermon. And now the quiet deacon had a question. "Now, Congresswoman, you mentioned corporate welfare. You're very passionate about it. I appreciate passion," he began, his voice a gentle, meandering drawl. "But let's talk about your track record on jobs. Shall we? Because I've been doing some reading, and I had to tell you. I'm a little confused." He slowly put his reading glasses back on, a deliberate, almost grandfatherly movement, and picked up a document from his stack. "You mentioned Amazon. That's a good place to start. You famously opposed Amazon's HQ2 in New York City. Is that correct?" AOC, still radiating the confidence from her opening statement, nodded, her chin high. "That's correct, Senator, and I'm proud of that decision." "Oh, I can tell you're proud," Kennedy said, his tone unfailingly amiable. "You wore that pride like a championship belt. Tweeted about it, gave interviews, really celebrated that victory." He paused, looking over his glasses. "Now, help me understand something, and I'm just a simple country lawyer. So forgive me if I'm missing something obvious, but didn't Amazon promise to create about 25,000 to 40,000 jobs in Queens?" This was the first pitch. A slow, easy softball. Ocasio-Cortez swung with dismissive confidence. "They made promises, Senator. Corporations always make promises." It was the exact answer he was waiting for. "Indeed, they do," Kennedy agreed, nodding. "Indeed, they do." He then held up a thick, bound document. "But let's talk specifics, because I have here the actual agreement that was on the table." According to this agreement, Amazon legally committed, to creating 25,000 jobs with an average salary of approximately $150. He let that number hang in the air before continuing. "That's $3.75 billion in annual wages." The economic impact study, commissioned by New York State, not by Amazon, estimated a total economic benefit of $27.5 billion over 25 years. He set the document down and looked at Ocasio-Cortez, his expression one of polite confusion. "Now, Congresswoman, that seems like a lot of money for Queens. For your district. Help me understand why that was bad for your constituents." AOC shifted in her seat. The first slight, almost imperceptible falter in her armor. "Senator, you're oversimplifying a complex issue. There were serious concerns about gentrification, about the impact on local communities." "Oh, I'm definitely oversimplifying," Kennedy interrupted, but his voice was so gentle it barely registered as an interruption. "That's one of my many flaws. But let's stick with simple for now, because I'm still trying to understand the math. You said New York was going to give away $3 billion in tax breaks. That was your phrase, wasn't it? Giving away billions." "That's correct," she said, her voice hardening. "See, this is where I get confused," Kennedy said, smiling. "Those weren't tax breaks on money New York already had. Those were tax breaks on future taxes Amazon would pay on revenue they were going to generate. Revenue that wouldn't exist without them being there." He spread his hands. "So, New York wasn't giving away money. They were just agreeing to collect slightly less money than they otherwise would have from a brand new source. You can't give away something you don't have. That would be like me offering not to charge you for a piece of the moon. I don't own the moon, so I'm not really being generous. Am I?" A few chuckles from the Republican side. AOC's jaw tightened. "The point, Senator, is that we don't need to bribe corporations." "Oh, I agree. No bribes. Absolutely not," Kennedy said cheerfully. "So, let me ask you this. After you killed the Amazon deal, and killed is the right word, isn't it? Because the deal died, what happened?" Here, Ocasio-Cortez saw a trap, but thought it was for him. She leaned forward, her triumphant tone returning, as if she'd been waiting for this exact question. "Amazon opened an office in New York anyway, Senator, without the tax breaks, exactly like I said they would." Kennedy's gentle smile widened. The trap had just sprung. "They sure did," he nodded, as if congratulating her. "Opened an office in Manhattan, not Queens. About 1.500 jobs, not 25,000. He paused, then tilted his head. "And, let me make sure I have this right. Those 1.500 jobs, They are not in your district. Are they? Silence. The word, when it came, was quiet. Congresswoman? Kennedy's voice was still gentle. But now there was a sliver of steel underneath. Are those 1.500 jobs in your district? No, Ocasio-Cortez admitted. They're in Manhattan. So, let me see if I understand the math here, Kennedy said, because I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. And then, in a move that reporters would later describe as a devastating piece of political theater, Senator John Kennedy reached into his briefcase and pulled out an actual physical calculator, a cheap, solar-powered Casio. In a world of high-tech hearings, the analog prop was a stroke of genius. He was just a simple country lawyer. After all, he made a show of punching in the numbers. His brow furrowed in concentration. You turned down 25.000 jobs for your district. You got 1.500 jobs outside your district. That's a loss of 23.500 jobs. He punched in more numbers. You turned down an average salary of $150. Those 1.500 Manhattan jobs. Let's be generous and say they pay about the same. So that's about $225 million in annual wages for New York City. Compared to the $3.75 billion you could have had. That's a loss of $3.5 billion in annual wages. He looked up from the calculator, his eyes finding hers. The gentle grandfather was gone. Congresswoman, in Louisiana, we'd call that a bad deal. What do you call it in New York? I call it standing up to corporate greed. Ocasio-Cortez shot back, her voice rising, her composure cracking. I call it refusing to be blackmailed. But Amazon came anyway. Kennedy interrupted, his voice still calm, driving the stake in deeper. They wanted to be in New York so badly they came without the incentives. Which means, you had all the leverage. And you gave it away. You could have negotiated a better deal. You could have gotten more community benefits, more local hiring, more affordable housing commitments. Instead, you killed 25.000 jobs and declared victory. He let that sink in. Meanwhile, Virginia, Arlington, specifically, they got their part of HQ2. They're thriving. Those jobs exist. Those wages exist. Those tax revenues exist, in Virginia. Not New York. Ocasio-Cortez's face was flushed. This is a gross oversimplification of. Oh, I'm sure it is, Kennedy said, his sympathetic tone returning, which only made it worse. I'm sure there's a very complicated explanation that makes perfect sense to you. But here's what I can't figure out. You said corporations should come without incentives. Amazon did exactly that. And they created 1.500 jobs instead of 25.000. So, the incentives, they would have created the 23.500 additional jobs. Doesn't that mean the incentives worked? The logic trap was perfect. And everyone in the room, including the activists in the gallery, could see it. She had no good answer. If she argued the incentives didn't work, she'd have to explain why only 1.500 jobs appeared. If she admitted the incentives did work, she'd admit she was wrong to kill the deal. She chose anger. Senator, this is exactly the kind of corporate apologist-ism that has destroyed working-class America. You're carrying water for billionaires. Kennedy leaned forward, and for the first time, his voice lost all its folksy charm and found a cold, hard edge. Congresswoman, I'm not carrying water for anyone. I'm asking about the 25.000 people in your district who could have had jobs. But don't. I'm asking about the schools that could have been funded with $10 billion in new tax revenue. But weren't. I'm asking why you're taking a victory lap for leaving your constituents worse off. He picked up another document. His calm restored, but the shift in power was total and irreversible. And while we're on the subject of your district, let's talk about where you live. Shall we? The pivot was so seamless, so sudden, that Ocasio-Cortez didn't see it coming. The hearing room was still processing the raw, brutal math of the 23.500 lost jobs when Kennedy, without missing a beat, changed the entire vector of his attack. What does where I live have to do with, she began. An automatic, defensive parry. Well, you mentioned gentrification, Kennedy said, his voice as pleasant and unhurried as if he were discussing the weather. You said you were worried about gentrification in Queens if Amazon came. That's a valid concern, a very serious one. Gentrification is what happens when wealthy people move in and drive up prices, pushing out the working class people who live there. He paused, his eyes scanning his notes. Then he picked up a new, glossy document. It appeared to be a printout from a high-end real estate website. So, I did some research on your residence. Kennedy continued, his tone still purely conversational. You live at the Navy Yard building in Washington, D.C., is that correct? AOC hesitated. The trap was now visible. But she was already in it. My D.C. residence? Yes. Tell us about this building. Congresswoman, for those of us who aren't familiar with the finer accommodations in the district. It's an apartment building, she said curtly, her voice sharp. Oh, it's a bit more than that, Kennedy said, as if correcting a minor good faith error. He began to read from the listing, his voice laced with a subtle, disarming wonder. It's a luxury apartment complex, where studios start at $2 a month. Amenities include, and here he slowed his drawl, savoring each detail for the record, a climbing wall, several pools, racquetball courts, a golf simulator, a rooftop dog park, a steam room, multiple cycling studios, 2 types of massage rooms, and, charging ports for electric vehicles. He looked up from the paper, his gaze mild but piercing. That's quite a place. A golf simulator, massage rooms, a rooftop dog park. Sounds lovely, must be nice. I failed to see what my apartment. I'm getting there, Kennedy assured her, holding up a hand. See, this is where that simple country lawyer thing kicks in again. I get confused. You talk a lot about billionaires and the rich, and how they need to be taxed into oblivion. You wear dresses that say, tax the rich to fancy galas. You tweet day and night about income inequality. But you, the champion of the proletariat, live in a building with a rooftop dog park and a golf simulator. He didn't wait for a response. The questions were purely rhetorical, each one a brushstroke in the portrait he was painting. And you shop at Whole Foods, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is owned by Amazon, the very company whose jobs you just bragged about killing. He let that juxtaposition hang in the air for a full second. And you park your Tesla, made by Elon Musk, a billionaire you regularly criticize, illegally in the fire lane. Because, according to reports, you can't be bothered to walk from a legal parking spot. The room had gone completely, utterly silent. The activists' faces were frozen, a mixture of shock and confusion. The Democratic senators stared at their notes. This was no longer a policy debate. It was a vivisection. Do you see the hypocrisy here, Congresswoman? Kennedy asked, his voice dropping back to that almost gentle tone, as if truly asking for her help. You live like the very rich you demonize. You shop at businesses owned by the billionaires you attack. You drive a $59 car from a man you call a corporate welfare king. All while pushing a Green New Deal that would make cars unaffordable for the working people you claim to represent. You're a socialist with a luxury lifestyle. This is a personal attack. AOC stammered, her voice finally shaking, whether from anger or humiliation. It was hard to tell. You're attacking me personally instead of addressing the. I'm not attacking you personally, Congresswoman, Kennedy said firmly, his voice cutting through hers. I'm pointing out that your lifestyle contradicts your politics. There's a word for that. It starts with H and rhymes with hypocrisy. Can you guess what it is? This is outrageous. What's outrageous? Kennedy said, his voice rising for the first time. A flash of genuine, cold steel. Is that you lecture working people about sacrifice while you live in a luxury palace. What's outrageous is that you killed 25,000 jobs for your constituents and call it a victory. What's outrageous is that you came here today to insult my intelligence, my state, and my constituents, and you thought no one would push back. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. Well, Congresswoman, someone is pushing back. And we're just getting started. Chairman Roberts, seeing the hearing completely derailed, attempted to restore order. Senator, your time has expired. We need to. But Kennedy, having built a tidal wave of momentum, was not about to be stopped. He calmly shuffled through his papers, ignoring the chairman. Let's talk about that Tesla. Since we brought it up, Kennedy said, as if picking up a casual thread. In 2018, you attended a climate change town hall with Senator Sanders. Very serious stuff. And you were asked about Tesla. Do you remember what you said? Ocasio-Cortez's eyes narrowed. She was clearly on the defensive. Her mind racing to recall a statement from years prior. I've said many things about many companies. Oh, this was memorable, Kennedy assured her, picking up a new printout. You said, and I'm quoting you directly here, for far too long. We gave money to Tesla. We gave money to a ton of people. And we got no return on our investment. It's time we get our due because it's the public that funded and financed a lot of innovative technologies. He set that paper down and picked up another. A printout from a Vanity Fair article. That was October 2018. 2 years later, in October 2020, you told Vanity Fair magazine that you had just got a car. An electric vehicle, because of COVID and you didn't want to take the train anymore. Kennedy looked at her with an expression of exaggerated, folksy confusion. Now, Congresswoman, help me out here. You attacked Tesla for taking public money. You said the company owed the public. You criticized them specifically by name. Then, you bought a $59 Tesla Model 3. Does that seem consistent to you? I needed reliable transportation to travel between New York and D.C. during a pandemic. She said, her voice tight and defensive. At the time, Tesla was the only electric vehicle that could make that trip on a single charge. Oh, I don't question that it's a fine automobile, Kennedy said, his tone genially dismissive. I hear they're excellent cars. What I question is the principle. You attack a company, then you give them your money. You criticize corporate subsidies, then you personally buy the product from the company that benefited from those subsidies. You demonize billionaires, then you voluntarily help make Elon Musk richer. He flipped to another page. The portrait of hypocrisy now taking shape. Layer by layer. And speaking of billionaires, let's talk about that dress. What dress? She snapped. Though everyone in the room knew exactly what dress he meant. You know what dress, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice patient. The dress, the one that broke the internet. September 13, 2021, the Met Gala. Ocasio-Cortez shifted uncomfortably. I was invited to attend. Oh, you certainly were, Kennedy nodded, as if impressed. Invited to the Met Gala, where tickets cost $35 each. Where tables cost upwards of $200. Where the wealthiest celebrities and aristocrats in America gather to, well, to celebrate being wealthy celebrities mostly. He then held up the photo. A high-gloss printout that was now Exhibit C in his case. Ocasio-Cortez in a flowing white gown, posing for the cameras. The words, "Tax the Rich," emblazoned in giant red letters across her back. Now, I'll admit, it was a statement, Kennedy said, studying the photo. Quite a statement, but help me understand it. Because I'm confused again. You went to a $35 per ticket event, surrounded by the very people you call oppressors, wearing a custom designer dress that cost tens of thousands of dollars. With professional hair and makeup done at the Carlyle Hotel, one of the most expensive hotels in New York, all to tell rich people they should pay more taxes. It was making a statement at the heart of the establishment, Ocasio-Cortez said, the words sounding rehearsed, a line she had used many times before. It was bringing the message where it needed to be heard. Was it? Kennedy asked, his skepticism palpable. Because it seems to me you were enjoying the benefits of being rich while pretending to oppose richness. You mingled, you posed for photographs, you had a wonderful time. By all accounts, he glanced at his notes. And the designer you chose to promote? Brother Vellies, sells shoes for $700 a pair. Handbags for $1.500. And, this is my favorite, a comb for $95. A comb, Congresswoman, for $95. He let that sink in. These are luxury goods for rich people. You wore a "Tax the Rich" dress to promote a brand that sells to rich people. At an event for rich people. That's not making a statement. That's participation. The dress was borrowed, she began, but Kennedy cut her off. Was it? He asked, pulling out yet another document. Because according to the House Ethics Committee investigation that followed, there were serious questions about whether you improperly accepted gifts for that event. The room tensed. This was no longer about hypocrisy, it was about legality. "The committee investigated you, and I'm quoting their words, not mine, for potentially violating House rules by accepting impermissible gifts associated with your attendance at the Met Gala." He looked at her seriously. The gentle grandfather vanishing completely. Replaced by a seasoned prosecutor. "Did you violate House ethics rules, Congresswoman? That investigation was politically motivated." "That's not what I asked," Kennedy said, his voice firm. "Did you violate House ethics rules?" The matter was resolved. "Also not what I asked," Kennedy pressed, his patience unwavering. "Simple question. Did you accept gifts that violated House rules?" Her lawyer instincts, long dormant, finally kicked in. "I cooperated fully with the ethics committee. And the matter is closed." "So you're not denying it," Kennedy observed, translating her legalese for the public. "You're just saying you got away with it. Is that accurate?" Before she could answer, he leaned back, the picture of a man who had just proven his point. "But let's move on, because I'm more interested in the broader pattern here." He began to count on his fingers. "You attack Tesla. Then you buy a Tesla. You attack Amazon. Then you shop at Amazon-owned Whole Foods. You attack billionaires. Then you attend their parties in designer dresses. You criticize luxury. Then you live in an apartment with a golf simulator. You promote the Green New Deal. Then you spend $29 on ride-share services in 1 year. When your office is literally 1 minute from a subway station." Kennedy leaned back, his eyes dark. "Congresswoman, in Louisiana, we have an old saying, 'Don't piss on my leg and tell me it's raining.' You're asking the American people to believe you're a champion of the working class while you live like the rich. And when we point this out, you claim we're attacking you. We're not attacking you. We're just noticing that you're a hypocrite." The word, hypocrite, hung in the air like a thrown knife. Precise and brutal. AOC's face was red, her jaw clenched. She was a performer who had lost control of the stage. A brawler who had been clinically outboxed. Several reporters were typing furiously. Their faces buried in their laptops. No longer even pretending to watch the main event. They were simply transcribing the kill. "I represent working people," she said, her voice tight and strained. "Everything I do is for working people. You represent a district where the median household income is $66. Kennedy interrupted, his voice now flat, factual, devoid of its earlier folksy charm. "You make $174 as a congresswoman. Plus book deals. Plus speaking fees. You live in a luxury building with a golf simulator. You wear designer clothes to exclusive galas. You drive a car that costs more than many of your constituents make in a year. How, exactly, are you one of them?" "Because I came from them," she shot back. "I was a bartender." "You were a bartender 7 years ago," Kennedy said, dismissing the talking point. "Now you're part of the elite you claim to oppose. And there's nothing wrong with that. Success is good. Upward mobility is the American dream. But don't you dare pretend you're still tending bar while you're sipping champagne at the Met Gala. Have the courage to admit you change." He then flipped to a new page on his yellow legal pad. And the entire mood of the room, already tense, shifted dramatically. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, the performative, almost light-hearted gotchas about dresses and Teslas were over. Kennedy's tone became somber, heavy, and deliberate. "But let's talk about something more serious than your wardrobe in your car," he said, his voice dropping. "Let's talk about January 6th. If the previous attacks had been a dissection, this felt like an accusation. January 6th, 2021, was sacred ground in American politics. A day of genuine trauma, violence, and constitutional crisis. January 6th was a dark day for our republic," Kennedy began, and for a moment, he was no longer a partisan questioner but a senator of the United States. "No question about it. Violence against our institutions, against our people, against our democracy. It was wrong, it was criminal, and the people who engaged in it should be, and have been, prosecuted." He looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez, his gaze unwavering. "But I need to ask you about your account of that day, Congresswoman, because you've told a very, very dramatic story about your experience, and I have some questions about it." AOC stiffened. "I've been very clear about what happened." "You have been," Kennedy agreed, his voice laced with a new, unsettling calm. "Very clear, very detailed, very emotional. On February 1, 2021, you did a 90-minute Instagram live video. You described your experience in vivid detail. You said you feared for your life. You said you thought you were going to die. He pulled a transcript. These are your words. I did not think that I was going to make it to the end of that day alive. He paused, letting her own words echo in the chamber. That's a powerful statement, very frightening, and I believe you were scared. Fear is real, but I need you to clarify something for me. Where, exactly, were you on January 6th? I was in my office. Which office? Ocasio-Cortez hesitated, seeing the door Kennedy was opening. My congressional office. And where is that located? In the Cannon House office building. Kennedy nodded slowly, as if confirming a minor detail. He then pulled out a large, laminated map of the Capitol complex and held it up for the cameras. A professor revealing the key piece of evidence. For those watching who aren't familiar with the Capitol complex, let me explain the geography. Kennedy said, his voice patient. The Capitol building itself is the one with the dome. That's where the House and Senate chambers are. That's where the rioters breached the building. That's where the violence occurred on January 6th. He then pointed to a separate, distinct building on the map. The Cannon House office building is, across the street, connected by underground tunnels. Yes, but it is a physically separate building. He looked at her. You were in the Cannon building, correct? Not in the Capitol building itself. The Cannon building is part of the Capitol complex, she said, a flash of defensiveness. That's not what I asked. Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice firm but quiet. Were you in the Capitol building? The one with the dome? Where the rioters actually were? No, she admitted, but. So, when you said you thought you were going to die, you were in a different building than where the rioters actually were. They evacuated our building, she said, her voice rising. We didn't know where they were. That's absolutely fair, Kennedy conceded, his tone reasonable. You didn't know. In the fog of war. In the moment, I'm sure it was terrifying. But, after the fact, when you told your story on Instagram Live, you knew where you had been. Correct? You knew, by then, that you weren't in the Capitol building itself. I never claimed I was in the Capitol building. You didn't explicitly claim it. Kennedy acknowledged, a thin smile touching his lips. That's true, but you didn't correct anyone who thought you were. Either, did you? You told a story designed to make people believe you were in immediate, mortal danger from rioters, when in fact you were in a separate building that was being evacuated as a precaution. He flipped through his notes. His prosecutorial case building. Let me read from your own account. On that Instagram video, you said a man came banging on your door, shouting, "Where is she? Where is she?" You said he entered your office with tremendous anger and hostility. You said you hid in the bathroom, thinking you were going to die. You said this man looked at you with such rage that you feared for your life. Kennedy looked up from the transcript, his eyes locking onto hers. The hearing room was so quiet. The sound of a pen dropping would have been a gunshot. Congresswoman, that man, the one who came in shouting, the one you hid from in the bathroom, the one you said had tremendous anger, that man was a Capitol police officer, wasn't he? Silence. A stunned, absolute silence. Congresswoman, Kennedy pressed, his voice still quiet but relentless. That was a Capitol police officer, correct? Her face was ashen. He didn't identify himself properly. He was shouting. He had anger in his eyes. He was trying to save your life, Kennedy said, his voice hard as granite, cutting through her excuse. He was a Capitol police officer, doing his job under the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. And you characterized him as a threat. You strongly suggested that this officer, this hero, might have been trying to harm you. Have you ever apologized to that officer? Ocasio-Cortez's hands were visibly shaking now, her knuckles white on the table. I was describing how it felt in the moment. It was chaos. You slandered a police officer who was protecting you. Kennedy interrupted, his voice not loud, but sharp and penetrating. You turned a rescue into a threat narrative for your own political purposes. That officer probably has a family. Probably has kids who had to hear their dad, a hero, described as terrifying and threatening by a United States Congresswoman. Have you apologized? I described my experience, she repeated, her voice weaker. But we're not in the moment anymore. Are we? Kennedy said, his tone shifting from prosecutorial to something approaching cold disappointment. We are 4 years later. You know now what actually happened. You know that officer was helping you. You know you weren't in the Capitol building. You know no rioters ever entered your hallway. You know all of this. And yet, you continue to tell the story as if you narrowly escaped death at the hands of rioters. He picked up another document. Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina. Her office is 2 doors down from yours. She was there that day. Too. She tweeted, and I'm quoting, "My office is 2 doors down from at AOC and no insurrectionists stormed our hallway." She confirmed that your building was evacuated, but that no rioters ever entered your area. He looked up. Why did she feel the need to publicly correct your narrative? Everyone experienced that day differently. AOC stammered, falling back on the language of subjective truth. But facts are facts, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice flat. Either rioters were in your hallway, or they weren't. Representative Mace says they weren't. The security footage confirms they weren't. The evacuation records show your building was cleared as a precaution, not because rioters had breached it. So why did you tell a story that deliberately implied you were in direct physical danger from rioters? I was in danger, she shouted, her composure finally cracking completely. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know where they were. We heard they had guns. We heard they had bombs. And that fear, Kennedy said, his voice softening, a tactical move that made his next point even more brutal. That fear was legitimate. I don't question that you were scared. But there is a profound difference, Congresswoman, between being scared and being in immediate danger. There's a difference between describing your fear and creating a false narrative that exaggerates the threat. And there is a massive difference between being in a building that was evacuated and being in the Capitol building, where Officer Brian Sicknick died, where 140 officers were injured, where people were fighting for their lives, hand to hand, against a violent mob. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. Those officers, the ones who actually faced the rioters, who actually fought them, who actually bled. They don't get 90-minute Instagram videos with millions of views. They don't get fawning media coverage. They don't get to be the center of the story. But you, safe in your separate office building while they fought for you, you got to tell a dramatic, gripping story about nearly dying. Don't you think that is profoundly disrespectful to the people who actually faced the violence? Tears were forming in AOC's eyes now. Whether from anger, humiliation, or genuine emotion, it was impossible to tell. I shared my truth. Your truth isn't the truth, Kennedy said bluntly. Your truth is a story you told. The actual truth is that you were evacuated from a building that was never breached. Your truth is that you characterized a police officer trying to save you as a potential threat. Your truth is that you used that day, a day when people actually died, to make yourself the center of attention. He let that sit for a beat, then continued, his voice dropping again, signaling a new, even more sensitive line of attack. You even said, later, that you feared being raped. The room seemed to suck the air out of itself. On CNN, you told Dana Bash that you thought you might be raped that day. Congresswoman, that is a serious allegation. He looked at her, his expression now one of complete gravity. Do you have any evidence? That anyone attempted to rape you? Or even threatened to rape you? I felt that I was in danger of that. That's not what I asked, Kennedy said, his voice quiet but relentless. I asked if anyone actually threatened you with rape. No, but. So you felt you might be in danger of rape. And you stated that, publicly, on national television, knowing full well that no one had actually threatened you. Knowing that your statement would make headlines. Knowing that it would cement the narrative of you as a victim in the most visceral way possible. Kennedy's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a hammer. Congresswoman, do you understand how that diminishes the experiences of people, of women, who were actually assaulted? Do you understand how that uses the sacred, terrifying language of sexual violence, for political gain? AOC's lawyer, who had been sitting stone-faced, was now whispering urgently in her ear. She just shook her head, staring at the table. I stand by everything I said, she stated, her voice barely controlled, Almost a gasp. Of course you do, Kennedy said, his voice full of a sudden, sad pity. Because admitting you exaggerated. Admitting you used a national tragedy for your personal political narrative. We can't have that. Can we? He closed that folder, the symbolic gesture of a closed case, and opened a new one, thick with papers. AOC seemed almost grateful for the change of subject. Even if she knew, deep down, the trap was merely resetting. Let's talk about your policies, Kennedy said, his tone shifting instantly back to professorial. Let's talk about the Green New Deal. Kennedy's shift was masterful. He moved from the raw, emotional territory of January 6 to the cold, hard realm of economics, leaving Ocasio-Cortez no time to recover, no ground to re-establish her footing. The Green New Deal, Kennedy said, his tone now that of a curious academic. Your signature legislation, your big idea, the thing that's going to save America from climate change. He looked at her expectantly. Tell me about it. AOC, visibly grateful to be on what she thought was solid ground, seemed to reinflate. Her posture straightened. This was her policy, her brand. The Green New Deal is a comprehensive plan to address the climate crisis while creating millions of good-paying union jobs and ensuring economic justice for all. How much does it cost? Kennedy asked. The question is simple and sharp as a pin. The investment would be substantial, Senator, but the cost of inaction is far greater. How much does it cost, Congresswoman? Kennedy repeated, his voice still patient, but firm. He would not allow the pivot. Ballpark figure. You're proposing the single largest government program in human history. You must have a number. Estimates vary, depending on implementation, she began. The classic dodge of a politician who doesn't want to say the number. The estimate I've seen most frequently, Kennedy interrupted, is about $93 trillion over 10 years. Is that in the right ballpark? That's an inflated number used by critics. She shot back. It comes from the American Action Forum, a think tank that actually did the math on your proposal, Kennedy said, holding up their report. But fine, let's say they're wrong. Let's say they're off by half. That's $46.5 trillion over 10 years. He paused. Let's say they're wildly wrong. And it's only a quarter of their estimate. That's $23 trillion. He pulled out the cheap Casio calculator again. The prop, which had been so effective in the Amazon takedown, now seemed infinitely more menacing. The entire gross domestic product of the United States, the value of every single thing we make, do, and sell, is about $28 trillion per year, Kennedy said, looking at the calculator as if it were a sacred text. So even the most conservative, wildly optimistic estimate of your plan would cost nearly the entire economic output of America for one full year. Where does that money come from? We would tax the wealthy, Ocasio-Cortez said, her go-to answer. How wealthy? Kennedy pressed. What tax rate? A marginal rate of 70% on income over $10 million. The Tax Foundation did an analysis of that, Kennedy said, having anticipated the answer, flipping to a new page. Even if you taxed every dollar over $10 million at 70%, which assumes, generously, that those people wouldn't just move their money, you'd raise about $720 billion over 10 years. He looked up from his notes, his eyes wide with feigned confusion. Congresswoman, that's $720 billion. We need $23 trillion. That's the lowest estimate. You're not even close. You're not even in the same sport. Where does the other $22 trillion come from? Ocasio-Cortez was silent. The cameras zoomed in. You don't know, do you? Kennedy said, his voice not triumphant, but gentle, which was far more devastating. You proposed a plan that would require spending more money than essentially exists in the American economy. And you have no idea how to pay for it. You just assumed we'd figure it out later. He shook his head. That's not governance, Congresswoman, that's fantasy. He wasn't finished. Let's talk about the details. Your original resolution called for upgrading all existing buildings in the United States to be energy efficient. Do you know how many buildings that is? No, but about 130 million. Kennedy supplied. Even if you could upgrade each building for just $50, which is an absurdly low, laughable number. That's $6.5 trillion right there. Just for the buildings. He was punching the calculator again. And you proposed doing this in 10 years. That's 13 million buildings per year. That's 35,000 buildings per day. Every single day. For 10 years. Including Christmas. He looked at her, his expression serious, no longer mocking. Do you understand how physically impossible that is? Do you understand that we don't have enough contractors? Enough materials? Enough time? To do even a fraction of that? We would mobilize. You'd mobilize what? Kennedy asked, his voice sharp. A fantasy? This isn't World War II, where you can just convert car factories to make tanks. This is specialized work, and you'd be forcing private property owners to upgrade their homes and businesses whether they want to or not. Is that your plan? Government-mandated home renovations for 130 million people? The climate crisis requires bold action, she insisted. Bold and stupid aren't the same thing. Congresswoman, Kennedy said sharply. Bold would be investing in nuclear power, which is clean, reliable, and actually exists. Bold would be streamlining regulations for renewables. Bold would be realistic proposals that might actually work. He pointed a finger at her. What you're proposing isn't bold. It's delusional. Kennedy, now in complete control, pressed his advantage, shifting from the impossible math to the human cost. But let's talk about the jobs. Congresswoman, you said the Green New Deal would create millions of jobs. But every serious economic analysis, including those from nonpartisan groups, shows it would eliminate 3 to 5 million existing jobs in fossil fuel industries. Transportation and manufacturing. What is your plan for those workers? They would transition to green jobs, she replied, delivering the standard progressive talking point. Would they? Kennedy asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. A 55-year-old coal miner in West Virginia. A man who has spent his entire life underground. Who has a specific, hard-earned skill. You're going to retrain him to install solar panels in Arizona? Is that your plan? He didn't wait for an answer. A 50-year-old truck driver in my home state of Louisiana. Who's been driving for 30 years. He's going to suddenly become a wind turbine technician. Do you hear how condescending that is? Do you understand that these are real people? With real lives, real mortgages, and real families? They aren't just interchangeable pieces on your grand political chessboard. He pulled out more papers. A stack that seemed to have no bottom. Here's what's happened everywhere these policies have been tried. Germany. They spent $580 billion on their energy wind. Their great energy transition. And what's the result? They now have the highest electricity prices in Europe. And they still haven't hit their emissions targets. In fact, they're more reliant on coal than they were before. Spain, he continued. Their solar subsidy program created a massive boom, and then went completely, spectacularly bankrupt, destroying the very companies and jobs it created, leaving a mountain of debt. California, he said, bringing it closer to home. They have rolling blackouts because their grid, so dependent on intermittent renewables, can't handle a heatwave. They have to beg other states for energy. Energy often produced by the fossil fuels they claim to despise. Kennedy looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez, his gaze steady and unforgiving. Every single place that's tried what you're proposing has failed. Every single one. What makes you think America would be different? What special, magical ingredient do we have that they didn't? We have to try, she said, her voice rising in frustration. No, Congresswoman, we have to think. Kennedy snapped back, his patience finally breaking. We have to plan. We have to use common sense. What we don't have to do is light our entire economy on fire based on a proposal written on the back of a napkin by someone who doesn't understand basic economics, basic physics, or basic reality. He then picked up what looked like a printout of a social media post. A document he had clearly been saving. When your office first released the Green New Deal, you also released an FAQ document. A document which you later deleted and claimed was a mistake. But the internet is forever. Congresswoman, we remember. He began to read from it. This draft FAQ. It talked about providing economic security for those unwilling to work. Unwilling, not unable. It talked about eliminating air travel within 10 years. It acknowledged the problem of, and I'm not making this up, farting cows, and suggested we might need to get rid of cattle. He looked at her over his glasses, his face a mask of incredulity. Did you write that, Congresswoman? Was that your plan? That was an early draft that was accidentally published by staff. Was it your plan or not? Kennedy pressed. It was a staff error. So, your staff, they just independently decided to propose eliminating all airplanes and getting rid of cows. And you had no idea? Kennedy's skepticism was a physical force in the room. Or, was that your actual plan? Until the entire country laughed at it. And then you claimed it was a mistake? Which one is it? Ocasio-Cortez's silence was a deafening admission. Here's what I think happened, Kennedy said, providing the narrative himself. I think you actually believed this stuff. I think you actually thought you could eliminate air travel, get rid of cattle, and pay people who just don't feel like working. And then someone, an adult with an ounce of sense, told you how clinically insane it sounded. And you tried to memory hole it. He sat back. The case closed. The Green New Deal isn't a serious policy proposal. It's a socialist wish list. It's a fantasy document written by people who have never had to meet a payroll, balance a budget, or understand where energy actually comes from. And the fact that you've built your entire political brand on it, well, that tells me everything I need to know about your judgment. Kennedy, now operating like a seasoned prosecutor, was relentlessly connecting the dots, moving from policy fantasy to personal ethics. He was no longer just attacking her ideas, he was attacking her character. But let's talk about those ethics. Congresswoman, since we've been discussing your policies, he said, opening a new, thin folder, Americans for Public Trust filed an ethics complaint against you earlier this year. Are you aware of this? Ocasio-Cortez, her face a mask of controlled fury, replied, I'm aware of politically motivated attacks. Yes. I'm sure that's how you see it. Kennedy said amiably. But this complaint alleges you misused your member representational allowance. That's taxpayer money. Congresswoman, money meant for official duties. For serving your constituents. He put on his reading glasses. According to the complaint, you paid $3.700 to someone named Juan D. Gonzalez for training. And, my personal favorite, you paid $850 to the Bombazo Dance Company. Also for training. He looked up from the paper, his face a perfect blank canvas of simple country confusion. Can you explain to me, Congresswoman, why the American taxpayers funded dance lessons for your office? Those were legitimate office expenses, she said, her voice clipped. For what? Kennedy pressed, his folksy charm returning. What official congressional purpose was served by paying a dance company? Were you training your staff to dance their way through legislation? Were you choreographing a new socialist ballet? Help me understand. That's a mischaracterization, she said, glancing at her lawyer, who shook his head slightly. Then characterize it correctly, Kennedy said, his voice hardening slightly. What was the training for? AOC's jaw tightened. I don't have those specific details in front of me at this moment. How convenient, Kennedy observed, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. You can remember every talking point for your $93 trillion Green New Deal. But you can't remember why you spent thousands of taxpayer dollars on a dance company. He leaned forward. Let me suggest a possibility. You used taxpayer money for personal expenses or campaign activities, which would be a violation of federal law. Is that what happened? Absolutely not. Then explain the dance lessons. Silence. Can't explain it? Then let's move on to something else you can't explain. Kennedy's entire demeanor shifted, the mockery vanished, and his voice turned cold and hard. Let's talk about your grandmother. Ocasio-Cortez's eyes widened. This was clearly a line she had not anticipated. My grandmother has nothing to do with. Oh, but she does, Kennedy snapped, cutting her off. In June 2021, you posted pictures of your grandmother's house in Puerto Rico. It had been damaged by Hurricane Maria years earlier and still hadn't been repaired. You posted these pictures, the damage, the blue tarp, the poor conditions, and you tweeted, and I'm reading your tweet, just over a month ago. The Biden admin agreed to forgive billions in disaster aid to PR. Storms aren't the most dangerous threat. Natural disaster recovery efforts that are gutted leave us vulnerable. He set down the printout. That tweet went viral. Millions of people saw it. People were outraged at how your grandmother had been abandoned by her government. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Except, here's what you didn't mention. FEMA and local Puerto Rican officials confirmed that aid was available to your grandmother. She had, in fact, declined the assistance. The room was paralyzed. This was a new, brutal level of attack. Your grandmother refused the help that was offered. Kennedy repeated, his voice low and dangerous. And you used her suffering, her living conditions, to attack the administration and make a political point. And when people, good-hearted people, called you out and started a GoFundMe that raised over $100 for your grandmother, you didn't thank them. You didn't accept the money. You just let other people fix your grandmother's house while you used her pain for Twitter engagement. That's not fair, Ocasio-Cortez said, her voice cracking. What's not fair, Kennedy said, his voice rising, is using your own grandmother as a political prop. What's not fair is having millions of dollars from your book deals and speaking fees. Living in a luxury apartment with a rooftop dog park. And refusing to help your own family. While blaming the government for a problem you could have solved with a single phone call. He didn't let her respond. He was already pulling out another set of photos. And speaking of political props, let's talk about the parking lot. What parking lot? She whispered, her face pale. You know what parking lot, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice now filled with something approaching disgust. June 2018, before you were even elected. You went to a protest about family separation at the border. A photographer took these. He held up the iconic, viral photos of Ocasio-Cortez. Her face crumpled in grief. Her hands clutching a fence. These pictures went viral, Kennedy narrated. Everyone shared them. AOC crying at children in cages. It became a rallying cry. It defined your compassion. He then held up a different set of photos. Wider shots of the same scene. Except, these pictures were taken in a parking lot. There were no detention facilities visible. There were no children. There were no cages. Just you, performing grief, at an empty fence. The photographer, Ivan Pierre, later confirmed it. Kennedy continued, his voice a relentless drumbeat of facts. You weren't at a detention facility. You were at a protest. In a parking lot. You weren't witnessing anything. He looked at her, his eyes filled with contempt. You staged a photo op. You staged it in an empty parking lot and let the world believe you were witnessing children in cages. That's not advocacy, Congresswoman. That's theater. That's using the suffering of other people, real suffering, as a backdrop for your own political career. I was at a legitimate protest. In a parking lot, Kennedy repeated, not at a detention center. Not witnessing anything, just performing for the cameras. And when people pointed this out, you accused them of spreading misinformation. But it wasn't misinformation, was it? It was the truth. You just didn't like that the truth made you look like a fraud. Kennedy gathered all his papers, stacking them into a neat, final pile. He was no longer a questioner. He was a judge, and this was his summation. Here's what I see, Congresswoman, he began, his voice calm, methodical, and utterly devastating. I see someone who kills 25,000 jobs in her own district and calls it a victory. I see someone who lives in a luxury palace with a golf simulator while preaching socialism to the masses. I see someone who attacks Tesla and then buys a Tesla. Who attacks Amazon and then shops at Amazon. Who attacks billionaires and then parties with them in $35 a ticket galas. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on hers. I see someone who exaggerates her own trauma from January 6th for political gain. Slandering a police officer who was trying to save her life. I see someone who uses the language of sexual violence to center herself in a national tragedy. I see someone who proposes a $93 trillion fantasy without a single credible idea of how to pay for it. I see someone who wants to eliminate airplanes and cattle. I see someone who misuses taxpayer money for dance lessons. His voice grew colder. I see someone who uses her own grandmother as a political prop. I see someone who stages fake photo ops in an empty parking lot and calls it activism. I see a record, not of achievement, but of hypocrisy, not of governance, but of performance. He paused, letting the weight of the indictment fill the silent room. And do you know what the worst part is? The most telling part? Even your own people. The people who made you, Even they have abandoned you. The Democratic Socialists of America, your revolutionary comrades, they withdrew their endorsement of you last year. Do you know why? Ocasio-Cortez said nothing. She was frozen. Because even they think you've sold out, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Even the actual socialists think you're a fraud. You've managed the impossible. Congresswoman, you are too extreme for normal mainstream Democrats, and you are not nearly extreme enough for the actual committed socialists. You are politically homeless, and it's because, in the end, you stand for nothing except your own advancement, your own brand, your own celebrity. Kennedy slowly removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez, not with anger, but with a final, dismissive pity. You called me stupid, Congresswoman. You said I probably think you can land on the sun if you go at night. That's a cute line, very quotable. I'm sure it did well on Twitter. But here's the truth. I'm not the one who thinks you can spend $93 trillion we don't have. I'm not the one who drove 25,000 jobs out of my own district. I'm not the one who lives in luxury while preaching sacrifice. See, the difference between us isn't intelligence. It's honesty. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. You pretend, you perform, you act, you tweet, and you have convinced yourself that the performance is the same as the reality. You think being popular online means you're right. You think having millions of followers means you don't have to answer hard questions. You think outrage is a substitute for competence. And that's why your record is what it is. That's why the only legislation with your name on it is a fantasy that even your own party won't vote for. That's why you are a cautionary tale instead of a success story. The people of New York's 14th district, they deserve better than a TikTok star pretending to be a congresswoman. They deserve someone who will create jobs, not kill them. They deserve someone who will tell the truth, not spin narratives. He closed his folder with a quiet, final thud. They deserve better than you, Congresswoman, and I suspect they're finally starting to figure that out. He looked at the chairman. I have no further questions. The silence that followed Kennedy's final sentence was absolute. It was not a respectful pause, it was a vacuum. A void left by the detonation. It lasted for 3 full seconds. An eternity in congressional time, where every millisecond is usually filled with partisan murmuring or the shuffling of papers. Then, the vacuum collapsed, and the room erupted into pure chaos. From the gallery, the progressive activists, who had sat in stunned, horrified silence for the last hour, finally found their voices. Shouts of misogynist and fascist rained down. Reporters, who had been frantically typing, were now on their feet, shouting questions, their faces a mix of professional excitement and genuine shock at the sheer brutality of the takedown. The C-SPAN video feed, which would later be analyzed frame by frame, showed the view counterclimbing so fast it looked like a slot machine hitting a jackpot. At the witness table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat frozen. Her face, which had cycled through confidence, annoyance, anger, and humiliation, was now a mask of barely controlled, incandescent fury. Her lawyer, his face pale, was pulling at her arm, whispering urgently, "We're done, we're leaving, now." For a moment, she didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at Kennedy, who was calmly, almost fastidiously, organizing his legal pad and his stack of printouts. He did not look at her. He was just a man, his work finished, tidying his desk. This, more than anything, seemed to break the spell. The sheer, calm indifference. AOC finally stood, her chair scraping against the floor with a raw, ugly, tearing sound that cut through the din. "This committee is a sham," she shouted, her voice shaking but carrying across the room. She was no longer speaking into the microphone. She was yelling at the institution, at the cameras, at Kennedy. "This is a partisan witch hunt. It is a disgrace, designed to intimidate and silence." "The Congresswoman is not recognized," Chairman Roberts said weakly, banging his gavel with all the authority of a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a teaspoon. "The witness is excused." But Ocasio-Cortez was already moving, storming toward the exit, her lawyer trailing in her wake. She paused at the door, turning back to point a trembling finger at the dais. Not just at Kennedy, but at the entire Republican side. "You want to know why people don't trust this government?" she yelled. her voice breaking. It's because of men like him. Old, corrupt men who use their power to bully and attack women. This is not oversight. This is abuse. The heavy chamber doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the rest. The room, if possible, erupted again. The activists were chanting, "Shame, shame, shame." The Democratic senators on the dais looked shell-shocked. Their star witness routed. Their carefully planned media event turned into a public execution. Through it all, Senator John Kennedy remained a perfect island of calm. He made a few final, careful notes on his yellow legal pad. A young staffer leaned in to whisper something, likely about the media storm already exploding in the hallway. Kennedy just shook his head. A slight, almost imperceptible motion. No statements, he said quietly, his voice inaudible to all but the aide. Let it speak for itself. Reporters were now shouting questions directly at him. A cacophony of, "Senator, do you stand by your statements? Was that appropriate?" He ignored them all. He carefully gathered his papers, stacked them neatly, and placed them, one by one, into his worn leather briefcase. He stood, buttoned his old Navy jacket, and, with the unhurried gait of a man heading to lunch, walked toward the same door Ocasio-Cortez had just stormed through. The press corps swarmed him at the threshold. "Senator Kennedy," a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in his face. "Do you have any comment on the Congresswoman's accusations that this was a witch hunt?" Kennedy paused, turning back. His expression was mild, almost befuddled, the grandfatherly persona slipping back on like a comfortable coat. "I think I've said all I need to say. The Congresswoman's record, well, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? Are you worried about backlash from progressives?" Another called out. "This will be seen as a misogynistic attack." Kennedy smiled, that gentle, disarming Louisiana smile. "Son," he said, "I'm 74 years old. I stopped worrying about what people think of me around the same time I stopped worrying about what to wear to parties. I tell the truth as I see it. Folks can make up their own minds." He was almost through the door when a final, desperate voice shouted, "Senator, was any of that personal?" Kennedy turned back one last time. His expression was serious now. The folksy charm completely gone, replaced by the same cold, hard clarity he'd shown in the hearing. "No, sir, it wasn't personal. It was necessary. Someone needed to tell that young woman that Twitter isn't real life. That performance isn't governance, and that the American people deserve better than sound bites and socialist fantasies." He paused, letting the line land, "I guess that someone was me." And with that, he was gone, leaving the chaos of the hearing room behind him. The hearing room, a mere hour after the confrontation, was already a historical footnote. A stage being struck, a maintenance worker swept up the debris from the chaos, discarded coffee cups, dropped notepads, and, ironically, a single, "Tax the Rich" button that had fallen from an activist's jacket. Lying face up on the marble floor, he found Senator Kennedy's nameplate at the dais, wiped it clean, and muttered to himself, "That was something. That was really something." But outside that quiet room, the explosion was just beginning. By the time the C-SPAN crew had packed their equipment, the video of the Kennedy AOC exchange had been viewed 3 million times online. By midnight, it would be at 15 million. By the end of the week, it would become the single most watched congressional hearing in a decade, eclipsing even the most dramatic celebrity or CEO testimonies. The next morning, the political media ecosystem reacted with predictable, furious, and highly profitable division. Fox News ran the entire 45-minute cross-examination on a loop, with commentary celebrating Kennedy's forensic destruction of progressive hypocrisy. CNN convened a panel of 6 pundits to debate, not the facts Kennedy raised, but the appropriateness of his tone, asking if the personal attacks had crossed a line. MSNBC dedicated its primetime block to a furious denunciation of the hearing, calling it a misogynistic, racist, and bad faith attack, while, in a telling omission, reluctantly acknowledging that Kennedy had raised some valid points on the optics of AOC's brand. The print media, with more time to dig, was even more devastating. The New York Times, to the shock of many, ran a brutal fact-check that confirmed, point by point, the accuracy of Kennedy's claims, the job numbers from the Amazon deal, the amenities in her luxury apartment, The details of the Met Gala ethics complaint, the location of her office on January 6, and the quotes from the deleted Green New Deal FAQ. The Washington Post published an editorial, not from the conservative side, but from a centrist liberal columnist, titled, "The Perils of Performance. Has AOC become a liability?" Even progressive outlets like Jacobin and The Intercept were forced to publish agonizing think pieces, asking whether their star had lost her way and embraced the very celebrity she claimed to despise. The political fallout was slower, but far more permanent. In the following weeks, internal polling conducted by the Democratic Party, and promptly leaked, showed Ocasio-Cortez's approval rating dropping. For the first time ever, in her own district, the numbers revealed that while her progressive base was angered for her, a larger, quieter contingent of working-class voters was angered at her. The 25,000 lost jobs, it turned out, was not a slogan, it was a number that represented real families. A month after the hearing, a credible primary challenger, a no-nonsense, 50-year-old Latina city councilwoman, announced her candidacy. Her slogan, "Less talk, more jobs." The Democratic establishment, which had once feared AOC's Twitter army, quietly began distancing themselves. Their private calls no longer returned. Their invitations to joint press conferences mysteriously lost. The revolution had, it seemed, been put on hold. 3 months later, on a quiet, humid Saturday morning in Baton Rouge, Senator John Kennedy was having breakfast at a Waffle House. He was by himself, sitting at the counter, reading a physical newspaper, and nursing a cup of black coffee. A young woman in her mid-20s, wearing a Louisiana State University sweatshirt, approached him hesitantly. "Senator Kennedy?" she asked, her voice quiet. "That's me," he said, setting down his coffee and turning on the stool, his expression open and kind. "Can I help you? I just wanted to say, I watched that hearing, the one with AOC." Kennedy just waited, his expression neutral. I've been following her for years," the young woman continued, her words rushing out now. "I thought she was amazing. I volunteered for her. I donated. I argued with my parents about her. I defended her online, constantly. I thought she was the future." Kennedy just nodded, listening. "And after watching that hearing, after seeing you lay out, just everything, all the facts, one after another, I was so angry at you." She paused, "But then, I went and checked. I fact-checked you. I wanted you to be wrong. I spent a whole weekend. And, you weren't wrong. About the Amazon jobs. About the apartment. About the parking lot. About all of it." The young woman looked down, then met his eyes. "You made me realize I'd been fooled. I'd been so caught up in the performance. In how inspiring she seemed. In how she made me feel, that I never, not once, actually looked at what she'd done. Or what she'd failed to do." She took a breath. "You made me realize that I need to care more about results than rhetoric. About substance than style. About the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. More than tribal loyalty. So, I just wanted to say, thank you." Kennedy stood, slowly, and shook her hand. His grip was firm. "Young lady," he said, his Louisiana drawl soft, "you just made my whole week. The fact that you were willing to question your own assumptions, to check the facts for yourself, to think critically. Even when it hurt." He smiled. "That's what this country needs. More than anything, don't you ever lose that." After she left, Kennedy sat back down. His wife, who had been sitting in a booth across the diner, had watched the whole exchange. She raised an eyebrow. "Well," she mouthed, "I guess it was worth it after all." Kennedy smiled, a genuine, private smile, not the one he used for the cameras. "I guess it was," he murmured. He turned back to the counter and took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee. Outside, life went on. The sun shone, traffic moved, people went about their business. And in Washington, the great, endless, deafening show continued. But here, in a Waffle House in Baton Rouge, someone had decided to stop performing and start thinking. And that, Senator John Kennedy figured, was a start.